XCredits-Style private off-chain transactions is a new way to send Bitcoin between two parties without disclosing where it's coming from, where it's going to, and how much is being sent. XSPOCT is great because it turns Bitcoin into a privacy coin. It doesn't require a change in the Bitcoin protocol. It possibly removes the need for other privacy coins like Monero and Zcash. It's completely trustless, and it has the full Bitcoin double spend resistance. In this video, I'll break it down into a number of sections. Firstly, the motivation for privacy. Then a technical intro, an explanation of the demo transaction and protocol as seen in our GitHub repository, the advantages and limitations of XSPOCT, and the next step for XSPOCT and XCredits. Don't forget to check the description links to our repository, to the XSPOCT whitepaper, our website, social media, and donation address. And if you like this, remember to share to your favorite cryptocurrency forum, Facebook group, and subreddit. Now, before I get started, a couple of important disclaimers. This is not the XCredits core project, which is our highly scalable blockchain solution. And most importantly, we don't recommend sending XSPOCT using real Bitcoin just yet, because the protocol is very, very early and untested and not 100% peer reviewed. So with that in mind, let's get started. Why would people want to have privacy in their blockchain transactions? Well, firstly, people value their privacy for completely legal activities. They don't want everything they buy or sell to be seen by everyone else in the community, even if they are comfortable with their bank and the government knowing. And secondly, and very importantly, it's required by law to keep financial transactions private in many cases. That means that banks can't use Bitcoin for customer transactions, and it could be a possible motivation for using private chains. So how do we send private transactions? What we do is we only put the proof of a transaction on the blockchain in the form of a hash, not the entire transaction information. And then we only tell the person who we send the Bitcoin to how to interpret the hash data on the blockchain. XSPOCT has two important levels, the on-blockchain activity and the off-blockchain activity. On the off-blockchain activity, we'll be developing an XSPOCT node, and that contains information about a series of burn transactions that indicate the next Bitcoin address from which the XSPOCT node can be sent. So first, let's take a look at Alice. Alice is going to create an initial burn address. And this is a bit of an oversimplification, but basically it contains a hash of the proof input address, the place where Alice will be able to spend her XSPOCT node from. What she does is she sends real Bitcoin to the hash of that input address. And that creates the initial burn address that proves that she's destroying some Bitcoin to be turned into an XSPOCT node. Alice now has an XSPOCT node, and she can transfer that on to Bob. So let's ask Bob to send Alice a hash of the proof input address that he wants to spend his XSPOCT node from. Alice then takes the hash of the proof input address 2. She adds it to her XSPOCT node. You'll note that Alice can't determine the proof input address 2, which Bob has provided, because it's in hashed form. Alice then makes a very small transaction from her proof input 1 address that was included in her initial burn address, and then sends it to the proof burn address 1. That proof burn address 1 is equal to the hash of the proof input address 2. Alice then sends that XSPOCT node to Bob with the information that allows Bob to determine whether he has been sent XSPOCT nodes legitimately or not. So Bob can use the XSPOCT node to validate the transactions. He can check that the hash of the proof input address 1 is equal to the initial burn address, and he can also prove that the proof input address 1 sent a transaction to the proof burn address 1, which is derived from the hash of the proof input address 2 that Bob sent to Alice. Now Bob is in control of this XSPOCT note and can validate that he is the rightful owner of it. If he then wants to send it on to Charlie, he asks Charlie to send the hash of where he wants to send the XSPOCT note from. He adds that to the XSPOCT note, and then he sends a very small transaction from his proof input address to Charlie's proof burn address 2. He then sends that XSPOCT note to Charlie with all the information that will allow Charlie to validate that transaction. The amazing thing about XSPOCT notes is all of the proof transactions appear in the clear, but they are completely unconnected to an external viewer. Now Charlie can see the full transaction history of where the XSPOCT note came from, but Alice knows nothing about Charlie, and outsiders can't see anything about the XSPOCT notes and where they were transferred to. In fact, because this is being sent to obfuscated burn addresses, the outsiders don't even know that the Bitcoin has been sent to an XSPOCT note. In this section, I'll show you how to get started with the XSPOCT repo. Firstly, you need to clone the repo. So go to this address. I'll put the link in the description section. That will take you to this address where you can clone or download the repository. Next, when you have it on your computer, use npm install to get going. Then you need to generate an address to send the testnet coins to by running node step 1 generate faucet address.js. You need to go into the file results source-key.json and copy the address from there. Then you need to send yourself some testnet Bitcoin to this address from a testnet faucet. Just enter your address into here and click give me some coins. Next, you need to run the code that charges up the multiple addresses where the proof transactions come from. So run node step 2 generate fee addresses.js. And finally, run the code that demonstrates the XSPOCT transactions by running node create and send xspot.js. Firstly, Alice creates some XSPOCT by burning some Bitcoin. In this transaction, Alice will create 2 XSPOCT notes in a single transaction. This is one of the features of XSPOCT notes. You can take some Bitcoin, send it to an XSPOCT note, and then send that XSPOCT note to 2 separate people. So we'll demonstrate sending 2 XSPOCT notes in a single transaction. Firstly, we need to generate some outputs for where the XSPOCT notes will be sent from. So we show that each address will receive 100,000 Satoshis. We generate 2 different proof input private keys. From that, we generate 2 separate proof input public keys. And then we generate 2 proof input addresses. And this is where Alice will be able to spend these XSPOCT notes from when she wants to send it to someone else. She turns that into a spend info string for each of these outputs. And I'll just format that string for you nicely. As you can see in there, there's the proof input address, MPMC. There's the specification of the XSPOCT protocol, which at the moment is 0.1.0 because it's very, very early. And the verification platform, which at the moment is staying as the Bitcoin testnet, but theoretically we could send it to other blockchain platforms, such as the Bitcoin LiveNet, Dogecoin, Ethereum, any other platform that could theoretically interact with an XSPOCT node. And then we turn that spend info string into a spend info hash. And we'll hold on to that spend info hash because we'll be using it in a second. The next thing that we have to generate is the transaction string. And in that transaction string, we have information about where the transaction can be spent from in the future. And I'll reformat that for you as well. As you can see, you've got the source where it originally comes from, the Bitcoin testnet, and you have the two outputs, both with the amount of 100,000 Satoshis. As you can see, the spend info hash is there, B9129. We take that string and then we hash it. And we'll be using this hash to generate a burn address. If we go back up to the top of the burn transaction file, you'll see that there's an address that comes from the hash, and Alice will send Bitcoin to this address to burn them into an XSPOCT. Now we can look up this address. We've already sent this transaction. So we go to block cipher. I'll put a link in the description. You can see that 0.002 Bitcoin or 200,000 Satoshis was sent to MWJ2RF. The next step is we have to make it so that other people can prove that they are receiving an XSPOCT note. So we'll format that into the XSPOCT note format. Firstly, we need to have a section for burn transactions. We take that original address that we just created, and in there we put the transaction string that formed that burn address. You'll note that if we hash and then transform it into a Bitcoin address, the transaction string becomes that burn address. The next thing that we add is the spend info strings. Also, if you hash this spend info string, it turns into that spend info hash, which is the reference for that element. You'll note also that this spend info string hash appears in the transaction string, and we can use that to verify the chain of holding of the XSPOCT node. Finally, we enter the transaction ID where the transaction occurred on the blockchain, and that fills up the burn transaction section. The next thing that we do is we add the XSPOCT transactions. At the moment, there are no XSPOCT transactions, just the burn transaction, so we'll leave that empty. We add some extra information that makes it easy to use the XSPOCT note, so we include the current transaction. At the moment, it's the burn address, so we put that burn address into the current section. We also include information about the next transaction. So we put in the input proof address, and you can, the proof input address, which you can see in the spend info strings, and the proof input private key. This is Alice's first XSPOCT, XSPOCT 1. There's another version of it, the XSPOCT 2, and as you'll see when I flick over, it has different addresses and private keys. So here's XSPOCT 1 and here's XSPOCT 2. The next step is that Alice wants to send Bob some XSPOCT. So we get Bob to send Alice the payment instructions. So what does that look like? So we generate some private outputs. We generate the amount, 100,000 Satoshis, the proof input private key. From that, we generate the proof input public key. From that, we generate the proof input address. This is where Bob will be sending his XSPOCT note from in the future. He then generates a spend info string, and he generates a spend info hash from the spend info string. And he'll send this spend info hash and the amount that he's requesting to Alice, and she'll include that in her future transaction. Note that Alice can't determine where Bob will be spending the next XSPOCT from, because she's only getting the hash of the spend info string, not the information about the proof input address. The next step is that Alice generates a transaction string with the information Bob gave her. So let's look at that transaction string. It has outputs. In this case, there's only one. We're sending it from that 100,000 Satoshi output, and we're going to give all of it to Bob. We take the spend info hash that Bob gave to Alice, and we put it into the outputs. We add the specification, and we also add the change address. And this is very important because when we send the proof transaction, we have a address that we're sending to and a change address. And we need to prove that that change address isn't another XSPOCT burn address. So what we do is we create a message and then we sign that message so that people can tell that it isn't another XSPOCT burn address. Alice takes that whole string, she hashes it, and then she turns it into a Bitcoin burn address. The next step is that Alice sends an on-chain transaction to prove that she sent the XSPOCT to Bob. What she does is she takes her original XSPOCT note and she adds a new entry into the XSPOCT transactions section. She puts in the address from where she spent the XSPOCT. In this case, it's the MPMC address that she's spending it from. She adds the transaction string that she created in step 4, which includes Bob's spend info hash. She puts in the proof input address again, and she puts in the proof burn address. And the proof burn address, once again, is created by hashing the transaction string and converting it to a Bitcoin address. Now, we can take this proof input address and we can look up once again on BlockCypher that this is the first and the only time that this XSPOCT note has been sent. So let's search for that. We look it up, and as you can see, the proof transaction has gone from MPMC to MVMRN. This is the burn address here, and this is the change address here. What we do is then we take that transaction information, we place that transaction ID into the XSPOCT transactions for this element. We need to do a few other things. We need to update current with the latest information and delete the private keys from next. It's not absolutely necessary to do this, but it just makes things simpler. In the next step, Alice sends the XSPOCT note to Bob, and Bob adds his information to it. So this is the XSPOCT note as Alice sent it to Bob. What Bob does is he adds to the XSPOCT transactions section for MPMC the spend info string that generated the spend info hash. So if you take that spend info string, hash it, it becomes that spend info hash in the transaction string. The next thing he has to do is he needs to add to the next section of the XSPOCT note. He puts in his proof input address for the next transaction and also the proof input private key so that it's easy for him to spend this XSPOCT note in the future. He can now save his XSPOCT note and send it along in a similar way to the way that Alice just sent that XSPOCT note to Bob. And I recommend that you go check out the repository to see how Bob sends his XSPOCT note to Charlie. Just a couple of notes on what we do in this library. Firstly, our hashing algorithm, I've called it SHA-256+. Basically, we SHA-256 the message, then we add the message again, and we SHA-256 it again. The other thing that we do is we generate a burn address using the generate burn address from hash function in XSPOCT.js. So go check that out to see how we do that. XSPOCT notes are pretty amazing for a few reasons. Firstly, all the proof transactions appear completely unconnected. No one can join the dots between these XSPOCT transactions. Outsiders can't see anything. All of the information is hashed and no information can be gleaned from the on-chain transactions. The people who receive XSPOCT notes can only look up the chain. Once you've sent it on to someone else, you can't see down the chain and see who that person sends that XSPOCT onto. This drastically reduces the analysis that external parties can do on your transactions, which drastically increases your privacy. And it makes tracking effectively impossible unless someone gets hold of your particular XSPOCT note. Now, of course, with any system, there are going to be limitations. This isn't perfect, despite it being a substantial step forward. So firstly, all the transactions must be on the chain, which means there's a scaling limitation. This is especially important because there are 2 transactions per transaction in the XSPOCT system. You have to send money to the proof input address and then on to the proof burn address. So transactions might start to get a little bit expensive. Another limitation is that once destroyed, the Bitcoin can never be recovered under the current Bitcoin specification. So be very careful when you create your XSPOCT. The protocol, once established, can't be changed for historical transactions. So if you send your XSPOCT under one system, then you have to maintain that protocol going forward when sending it on to others. And your XSPOCT notes are still technically connected to the fees that you pay to make the proof transactions happen. So there is a way for someone who in the future gets an XSPOCT note to look at the transactions that have been entered on that XSPOCT note and see where the fees were paid for to do the on-chain transactions. So it's a substantial increase in privacy, but there's still a way for some people to get some information from the XSPOCT notes. Some potential solutions include using a standardized note amount. Now, it might be very easy to identify a transaction by the specific amount of Bitcoin paid at that point in time. You can increase your privacy by using standardized note amounts like 0.1 Bitcoin and 0.01 Bitcoin. Use a platform with very low fees. If you use a platform with lower fees, you can reduce the amount of fees that you pay for your XSPOCT note. This is very important because we are sending those double transactions every time we're sending a transaction. Use a platform with high transaction capacity. Platforms with higher transaction capacities should have lower transaction fees and should be able to accommodate more of these private transactions. To increase privacy, you can use a platform where mining is easy. So if you use a computer mined reward to pay for your private on-chain transaction, it's going to be very hard for an external party to check where that transaction is coming from. And finally, get a larger trusted party to pay for the proof transactions, such as a bank that you trust not to divulge your private information. Now, it needs to be remembered that XSPOCT is a very early stage project. This is only a proof of concept. We don't have the verification system built. It doesn't have an end user wallet, and it needs a lot more testing. So we are very early stage on this particular project, and if the community is interested in it, we're currently raising about $1.5 million to build this functionality, either from donations, and if you'd like to donate, you could check out our donation address in the description, or via investors. So if you'd like to invest into this platform, please either send a donation through or contact us. As for the XCredits platform more broadly, XCredits is a brand new cryptocurrency. We're building a highly scalable, sharded blockchain which uses economic incentives to increase the broad network agreement between the shards. We'll also have a token system that's designed to integrate anti-money laundering and KYC, or Know Your Customer, functionality natively. So this is going to be a very useful and highly scalable chain. And we're currently raising up to $10 million to build the XCredits core functionality. So if you'd like to support either XSPOCT or XCredits core, please contact us at teamx@xcredits.com.